reasons to the effect of what Africom represents. However, let us ask ourselves why a great nation like America seems to be more interested in African security than we Africans ourselves. Is it for the sheer love of our continent, or is it for a strategic purpose? Is it in their interest, our interest, or both? Today, Africa has a combined GDP of about $1.5 trillion, United States dollars. My own estimations from the 2008 World Bank GDP data sheet. Nevertheless, our contribution by volume to world trade is still very negligible, at most less than 5%. And most of the goods exported from Africa remain raw unprocessed commodities, such as cocoa, diamond, gold, bauxite, timber, vegetables, and fruits. Africa remains highly endowed with natural resources, which we hardly process into finished goods, which also explains our weak position in the global economy. A staggering of 33 out of 53 countries in Africa have been classified by the United Nations as least developed countries. Again, as chronicled by David Lamb, the same American journalist, the renowned American journalist who traveled across Africa in the 80s, he says Africa holds the following economic potential. This was his estimate in the 80s. 1. 40% of the world's potential hydroelectric power supply. 2. The bulk of the world's diamonds and chromium. 3. 30% of uranium in the non-communist world. I don't know how many of you knew that the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan during the Second World War, the uranium came from Africa, precisely Congo. 50% of the world's gold, 90% of the world's cobalt, 50% of phosphate, 40% of the world's platinum, 7.5% of the world's coal, 8% of its known petroleum reserves. I'm sure by now it has increased drastically because of new discovery. 12% of its natural gas, 3% of its iron ores, 70% of the world's cocoa, and 60% of its coffee, 50% of its oil palm. This is the economic potential and value of Africa. It is interesting to note that in Congo, the Congo River, if it is dammed and a hydroelectric plant constructed on it, it has the one that is called the Inga project. Everything has been mapped, the plants are there, but nobody is taking it up. But we live to see what, if that hydroelectric plant is built, it can supply the whole of Africa energy and even expand supplies to Europe. These discoveries led David Lamb to conclude, arguably, that there is not another continent blessed with such abundance and diversity. I therefore very much agree with an observer who said, Africa is not poor, it's only poorly managed. President Obama, when addressing Africa at the floor of the Ghanaian parliament in July 2009, said, quote, Africa doesn't need strong men, it needs strong institutions. Africa therefore needs to develop these institutions that will create a basis for sustainable socio-economic development. However, all of a sudden, Africa has become the center stage for great powers in the world to flex their economic and military muscles. In a fashion akin to that of the 1884 scramble for Africa, the continent is now inundated by competing interests from China, US, Russia, and the EU. Chinese flow of FDI into Africa has overtaken World Bank investment and rivaled that of the US. The gold of South Africa and the former Gold Coast, the diamonds of Botswana, Liberia, Namibia, and Sierra Leone, the timber of the Congo, the uranium of the Congo, the oil reserves of the Sudan, Nigeria, Equatorial Guinea, Libya, Angola, and lately Ghana. And as my predecessor speaker said, Sierra Leone too has discovered oil. The oil reserves of Sudan, Nigeria, Equatorial Guinea, Libya, Angola, and lately Ghana, the cocoa of Ivory Coast and Ghana, have witnessed increased attention by investors from these very powerful countries. The irony of the situation is that whilst this inward flow of FDI on the surface looks promising for us in Africa, unfortunately, they seldom come on a win-win basis. You cannot have a continent whose institutions have been bastardized, have been collapsed through slavery and colonialism, and you think you can have a fair or free trade or fair competition on an equal basis. It's just not possible. It is incontrovertible that Africom creates synergy and harmonizes U.S. military operations in Africa. All Africa Students Union is aware the Africa Partnership Station of Africom is already in the implementation phase in many regions of Africa. That one we know. This position is well understood by us. However, the reception and response from many African citizens to Africom have been that of suspicion and mistrust, as is reflected by the ongoing campaign against Africom by many members of the civil society. These fears are not far-fetched. Knowing clearly the role played by the CIA in the overthrow of Ghana's visionary Kwame Nkrumah, who wanted a united Africa, the support for dictators like Mobutu Sese Seko are also the support for dictators like Mobutu Sese Seko and the indifference of US towards deviants like the late Idi Amin and Jonas Savimbi. Africans are also reminded of the failure of the UN, of which US plays a very important and significant role to protect the life of Patrice Lumumba, the first democratically elected leader of the Congo, and to avert or mitigate the Rwanda genocide and nip the Liberian civil war in the bud. Again, let us not forget, Liberia was a creation of the US government for freed African slaves, a situation which therefore imposed a moral obligation on America's conscience to act when it was most needed. As much as Africom, as argued by the US government, seeks to establish and promote peace in Africa, it cannot be divorced from America's awakened interest in protecting its own interest in Africa, especially the rich oil and gas reserves the continent holds. The US must therefore come clean and clear if it wants to be taken serious by Africans. The US needs to disclose fully its interest in Africa through Africom, and not assume the people of Africa are unaware of the possibilities of any hidden agenda. Though Africa undoubtedly can build the capacities of any AU, African Union standby force, to respond to the threats of terrorism and conflict on the continent, let us ponder over the question: whose war are we fighting? What price should we pay, and for how long? The US is like the big brother in the Committee of Nations, which has imposed on itself the task of policing the world. History is replete with the intervention of US in many wars across the globe. We know over 57,000 gallant US soldiers sacrificed their lives to save the nation called today South Korea. We know thousands more sacrificed their lives even during the Second World War. But we also know of Americans' failure in the Vietnamese War, of its inabilities to stop rogue North Korea from acquiring nuclear power, and its prolonged, protracted, ongoing war in Iraq and Afghanistan. As President Harry Truman once observed, what price should America pay to defend its freedom? Whatever the answer may be, history has clearly taught us that militarization is definitely not the answer, and not so even in Africa. The All Africa Students Union stands opposed to any attempts, therefore, whatsoever, to establish any military base in any part of Africa. We believe the militarization of Africa will not only pose danger to our peace, but also create conditions of fear and rivalry amongst our people. As Dr. Kwame Nkrumah said, Africa is not an extension of any other country or colony. We do not want to be drawn into the conflicts of powers which seek to maneuver their way in order to maintain their superpowership or superpowerdom. To the contrary, what Africa needs is democratization and not militarization. I bring another quote by Rodney Walter, quote, in 1972, quote, "The decisiveness of the short period of colonialism and its negative consequences for Africa spring mainly from the fact that Africa lost power. Power is the ultimate determinant in human society. Being basic to the relations within any group and between groups, it implies the ability to defend one's interests and, if necessary, impose one's will by any means available. In relations between peoples, The question of power determines maneuverability. In bargaining, the extent to which people survive as a physical and cultural entity. When one society finds itself forced to relinquish power entirely to another society, that in itself is a form of underdevelopment. Unquote. Rodney Walter, 1972. On their way forward, All Africa Students Union asserts the need for Africans to regain power, one that is of the people, for the people, and by the people. ASU does not blame other countries for Africa's current woes, but so are we not oblivious to the dangers of interference, of not controlling our own destiny and spearheading our own initiative. However, we still regard the UN as the most credible international institution to partner Africa to meet the challenges of the 21st century. The unilateralism and the superimposition of foreign crafted policies will never save Africa unless ownership comes from the African people themselves. In conclusion, I would like to say that the All Africa Students Union reaffirms her belief that the creation of equal opportunities for all Africans to realize their full potential, the consolidation of democratic institutions such as independent electoral commissions, a vibrant, responsible and independent media, a functional and independent judiciary that upholds the rule of law, the guarantee of universal adult suffrage, and the ability of the greater majority of citizens to elect and change their own government at will, as the best guarantees for security and sustainable development in Africa. ASU calls for the redemption of the ideals of the founding fathers of African political independence, a strong and united Africa, without which we remain vulnerable to the vagaries of the politics of our world. If European countries are strong and developed, they see the need to pass the Lisbon Treaty and form a sort of political union. It tells you that Africa cannot wait. All these challenges we are facing can best be tackled if we have a one strong, united continental union, whichever form of government is going to assume. That is the best way. In conclusion, I say, forward ever, backwards never. As Dr.
to our 15 minutes. There'll be plenty of time for discussion. There's no need to stop at I think at the 7 o'clock mark. We're going to now turn over to Jeremy Keenan, who's going to speak on, well, I'll let him introduce himself and put up his...
Thank you very much. I'll talk as quickly and as briefly as I can, because a quarter of an hour is not long. And just to say that what I can't get into a quarter of an hour, I've just put into 3 books on this subject. So there you are. Google my name and pick it all up. The first volume, there's a whole bunch up here. You know, publishers are like, they're desperate that students buy them. So afterwards, if any of you would like them, the Dark Sahara talks about how this was created. Then the 2 further volumes go on from there, and there we are. What I'm just going to talk about is give you a very summary outline of why and how Africom is in Africa. And in spite of the rubber stamp on it, which is it sort of legally came into existence in 2008, it really began in 1997, the conception. In fact, it began in 1992. Okay. Can you still hear me? Okay.
It's crashing on the...
Is it okay? Can you hear me all right at the back?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. It really began in 1992 after Iraq. 1997 is really the first important conceptual date, and 2 things happened then which you'll recall. One was, it was officially the drafting of the project for the new American century, which was a revamp of empire, if you like. And secondly, a very symbolic figure, it was the first year when American oil imports exceeded 50%. They'd been ramping up from way back Second World War. And finally, America became 50% of its oil was imported. That's a very important psychological figure. And that is what led to what earlier speakers were talking about, which was the Cheney report, the evaluation of America's dependency on foreign supplies of oil, which was published, interestingly enough, in May 2001. It was the first executive order of Bush when he became president. It was swamped, of course. It was hardly ever read by the American public. It was a document that was designed to shock. And it wasn't read, of course, because it came out in May. In September, you have 9/11, and the world had sort of moved on from oil supplies to terrorism. The basis of the Cheney report was, as we've heard, the major new source of American oil is Africa, and imports from Africa surpassed those from the Gulf a couple of years ago. I think it was actually earlier than that, but anyhow, officially last year. That gives you the importance of Africa and the resources of oil. The problem for America was how to access Africa. Get rid of the word access, because America only thinks of militarization, to securitize these resources, how to, in other words, militarize Africa. And this was a difficulty for it, because you can't just go and put Africom or any other command into a country in spite of this fiction that Africans were desperate to get a command of their own, a la UCOM. And what was decided, or the thinking behind this, was to use the global war on terror. This was, if you like, the driver, the justification for militarizing Africa. The problem was, of course, there was virtually no terror in Africa. So how do you legitimize militarizing the continent against terrorism when there's no terrorism there? There have, of course, been 2 incidents in the American embassies over on the east side of Africa, but that was a long way from where most of the oil is, and that's a rather different issue. And what we see is a very interesting coming together of events. There's a key date, a key series of 2 or 3 little events, mostly around July, August, September 2002. The first is that I won't spend too much time on these. These maps are a bit complicated, actually. Sorry, I might well have stayed with the last ones. Okay, just so you know what you're looking at, that is the Pentagon's map of Africa in 2003. Theirs is in colour. I put it to black and white because my publisher couldn't afford all the fancy stuff. Word for word what it was. But in 2002, in Algeria, which is up above the uncontrolled spaces, America and Algeria were forming a very close alliance. I won't go into the details of this. It was based on 9/11. Algeria went to the States and said, look, you think you've got a problem with terrorism. We've had it for years. We're the world experts. We've had 200,000 people killed here. The fact that the Algerian regime had killed most of them themselves is another matter. You need us. The hidden message of this from Algeria to America is, by the way, the world's had an embargo on us for the last 10 years or so. We're a bit short of arms. And as a country, we are an army with a country to run around. And so we need high-tech military equipment. If you give us that, we can give you lots of names of terrorists and all sorts of other exciting things. The American regime isn't totally stupid, and it didn't really go along with that. It said, yes, 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 what a wonderful idea. But after roughly 12 months, by about September 2002, about a year after 9/11, it hadn't delivered any of those weapons. So Algeria was starting to get a little bit fed up with America and started publicizing, it's no good being friends with America, they never keep their promises, etc. That was the first thing. The second, or related to that, America was saying, well, look, you've done such a wonderful job in getting rid of terrorism, you don't need this stuff. You're on top of the situation, you've done a wonderful job. Second thing was that America, at this time, 2002, was beginning to try and explain away Afghanistan, and was talking about what I call the banana theory of terrorism, which has now gone into military literature, of course, that after Afghanistan, the great victory, you'll recall, in 2001, when all these terrorists got flashed out, in fact they're still there, is neither here nor there, they allegedly swarmed, which is an American military term. These terrorists swarmed, and there's one document which even refers to 30,000 of them, from Afghanistan across the Horn of Africa in a curve sort of through here. This is the Pentagon's map of it. They came through here, this terrorist area, and started threatening Europe and had to be dealt with. This is what I call the banana theory of terrorism. It forms the shape of a banana when you actually put it out on the map. It is a complete fiction. Not a soul went through that route. But if that's what the Americans were saying, the Algerians knew this was a pack of nonsense. So the Algerians sort of said to the Americans, look, we can fix this up together here. We'll fabricate some terror down there. Then that's proof that you've got terrorists going through. Then you can give us a few more arms, etc., etc., etc. So you get this very interesting conspiracy between Algeria and the Algerian secret services in 2002. That came into being, or the catalyst for that, goes back to the Bay of Pigs, 1962, when the Americans realized after that they would have to invade Cuba, and they started planning how to do this, and the idea of the Northwoods. I don't know if you've heard of Northwoods, Google it, you'll pick it up. This was a plan which was signed by all members of the American Chiefs of Staff and the Defense Secretary, Robert McNamara, to fabricate terrorism in the States, bombings in Miami and Atlanta and all over the place, blamed it on Cubans, so we could legitimately go and invade Cuba, having failed with the Bay of Pigs. Those documents, John F. Kennedy blocked them. He was assassinated shortly thereafter. And those documents were sealed off and came to public light in 2002 and were picked up by the Defense Science Board, which is the Pentagon think tank, and they came up with a plan for Rumsfeld, which was basically, look, if we fabricate terrorism this way, we can flush out all these people and sort of control the situation that way. And Rumsfeld brought into being, at the same time as those other two things, a thing called the Proactive Preemptive Operations Group, P2OG, generally known to those with left reverence for American military history as the P2s. And in September of that year, the State Department sent two of its emissaries through this area, advising the government of a thing called the Pan-Sahel Initiative, which was basically a US invasion of about 500, that's about 1,000 special forces of one sort or another into that area. In October, they fabricated the first incident of terrorism. There'd been no terrorism in this area at all. It was trying to kidnap some tourists. They made a bosh of it, and it wasn't recorded at all. And then in February, March 2003, they went the whole hog and did it properly, and they kidnapped 32 European tourists, 8 different groups around here, by extreme Islamists. The GSPC, which was a small Algerian group, fairly well infiltrated and controlled by the Algerian security forces. And the emir, the leader of that, was a man with 12 different aliases, maybe more, generally known as El Para. And El Para was a DRS, that's security agent. He'd actually been trained in the States about 10 years before as well, ironically. And El Para was responsible for taking these 32 hostages, and this created the legitimacy for America to open a new, what they call a second front in the war on terror into Africa, on this area that the Pentagon's described here. And that provided the legitimacy in 2003 for militarizing the whole continent, because you'll recognize those phrases about the empty spaces and so on and so forth. These are the empty spaces that the American military was always talking about. This fabricated terrorism in this area, but it legitimized the expansion of military activity through the lily pads we talked about, and then on into Africom in 2008. But the person who was in charge of this operation, the Supreme Commander, was General Jim Jones, who by strange coincidence is Obama's National Security Advisor now. So you're not going to get a cleaning up of the stable when the guy who started the mess is advising the president on it right now. So that was 2002, 2003. It created a huge, massive amount of propaganda. As an academic, I sort of follow this stuff to the point of boredom. I gave up counting years ago when I'd gone through about 6,000 separate articles on it. I don't know what the number is now. Google this sort of stuff and you'll come out with truckloads of stuff. Get into the Africom website and it's all back there as well, or simulated versions of it. This created what the American number 2 in Africom at the time, it was UCOM then, described as the swamp. The Sahara was described as a swamp which had to be drained. It's a kind of stupid analogy. Al-Para, trained at Fort Bragg, was described by Bush as bin Laden's man in the Sahara. Within 3 days of these, of Madrid, Madrid was being blamed on this group here that was, if you like, this conspiracy between the Algerian intelligence security forces. They tried to wake up Europe, which wasn't paying much attention to all this. Remember old Europe, Rumsfeld. And the Americans were on about Europe's 9, 10, 11 miles away. They're going to be in there right of May. You're going to have a new Afghanistan up here. And all this propaganda was coming out. Now, that lasted for about 2 years, and it eased off through 2005, 6. It was still there, still being played around with, but it got revamped again when Africom became formally created in 2008. And we then get another cycle of hostage takings, 2 Canadian diplomats, then 2 Germans, 2 Swiss, a Brit who got killed, and more recently, the last few months, a Frenchman, 3 Spanish, 2 Italians, exactly the same pattern. What is interesting, they've been kidnapped by exactly the same people. It was back in 2003. Not Al-Para himself, because Al-Para is probably not a person, he's an identity. And there's no record, 3 records of him being visually cited, all of which are extremely dubious. But those 3 are the same 3 emirs now, who are in the press all day long: Abdul Hamid Abu Zaid, Abu Yahya, and Yahya Jawadi, same name, alias, and Mokhtar Ben Mokhtar. Google those in and you'll get thousands of things about Al-Qaeda in the Sahara. And not only did this group sort of reinvigorate themselves, if you like it, the same with Africom. Of course, this was instructed from the Algerian DRS, because the 3 leaders are DRS, that's Algerian security police agents, working with America, but they changed their name, because you've got to have a sexy name if you want to go around terrorizing people. And it's no good calling yourself Groupe Salafiste pour la Prédication et de Combat, because it kind of falls a bit flat. And it's no good calling it GSPC, because it could be anything. So they changed their name to Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. Well, that's a bit of a mouthful too, so let's just call it Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda in the Sahara, and it's now known as Al-Qaeda. They're now calling themselves the Sahara Emirate. And it's this area here. This is the area we talked about, or Vince talks about, many at the bottom of this area, Mali, and so forth. And there are about 400 so-called Al-Qaeda chaps running around there under 3 emirs, leaders who are members of the Algerian security forces, close allies of America, so the whole thing is fairly well orchestrated. It gets a little bit out of control because of the 400 or so foot soldiers. Most of them, of course, are unaware of how they're being manipulated, and they have to be kept in line, which is difficult, so there's a little bit of autonomy and instability sort of creeping in here. But that is the background for it. And again, we have the Americans saying we've got a really serious problem. Vince said so in the beginning here. These terrorists, these uncontrolled borders, etc., etc., etc. And this is why we need Africom in Africa to protect it from these extremists, these terrorists, etc., etc., etc. And of course, it is a massive lie. It's much more serious than that. It's not just America, of course, because the West in general, now I'm talking about Europe, I'm talking about British intelligence, French intelligence, Spanish, German, Dutch, Italians, I don't think are in the loop on this one, are fully aware of this. I know that because I briefed them. Okay? I also know because I also act as advisor to Lloyd's underwriters on kidnap and ransom in the Sahara. Okay, so not a single drop passes my attention. And I literally mean that I work on that 2 hours every single day to pick up the intelligence on that. But the reason why Europe has come on board, particularly those countries, is because we need terrorism. We use it to legitimize migration policy and everything else under the sun. It's a very useful thing for governments to have around. You can do all sorts of things with terrorism. But also, this area is not just an unforgotten wasteland, one of the world's richest resource areas. It is stuffed full of minerals of every sort under the sun, not so much oil and gas, that's 10 a penny in Africa now. Uranium, these are the major resources of uranium, right here, these areas. The major supply of electricity to this country is EDF France. France is 80% nuclear, and its entire nuclear capacity comes from mines, right where the tip of that arrow is here. And there's masses more of it along here. Gold, lots of other resources there. And Europe would quite like to have better control over them. And again, it's wonderful to use terrorism as the excuse to put our security forces in there, because the locals, the natives, these poor Africans, are quite incapable of defending their own countries. The fact that this is a fabricated creation which has got out of hand, and it is now a highly dangerous and unstable area, but as a result of this policy, and now when the PSI, the American Pan-Sahel Initiative, started, you could wander through here, have a picnic anywhere you like in this area, one of the safest places in the world, literally. Now, you haven't got a dog's chance of getting anywhere through here at all. You will be lucky to survive. It is that dangerous. Because you have not only created this situation, you've created a huge amount of anger amongst the population. It may be the desert, but there's still several million people living there. They are very, very cross. They're very, very, very angry. Of course, their economies have been completely destroyed by this, so they're into banditry, drugs trafficking, all the other things to survive, and really we have an appalling situation in this so-called terrorist area, which is the creation of US foreign policy, full stop. And that's my quarter of an hour up, and I'll leave you to ask questions. The obvious.
What I'm going to do, hello? Yeah. What I'm going to do is ask the panelists to move the chairs into the centre. Can we turn the top off? And we're going to have some comments and questions.